Okay, welcome. This is another Internet Skeptic video, and some of the criticism I received on some of my past videos was that I was cherry-picking data. I found that ironic because I was cherry-picking the data from Al Gore's movie. I basically was assuming that Al Gore is using the best data out there, so I chose most of his data to address. Well, to address that issue even further, what I did was I went out and I attended one of Lonnie Thompson's presentations on global warming. And what I'm going to do is basically, if I'm going to be accused of cherry picking, I'm going to cherry pick his data. And we're going to take a look at what Lonnie Thompson says about global warming. And we're going to take a look at each one of his claims. And we're going to take a look and see, does the data support his conclusions? Now, I titled this one, Pay No Attention to the Man Behind the Curtain. I did that because if you remember in The Wizard of Oz, everybody was scared of this evil wizard. The wizard was able to control entire societies, control the world, control all the people through fear because they were afraid of angering the great wizard. Well, it took Dorothy to take a look behind the curtain, and once she did that, she realized that there's nothing really supporting this evil wizard. There's nothing really to fear. It was all a bunch of hype. Well, if you take a look here, what do you see? Well, when we take a look behind this curtain, we're going to find Lonnie Thompson. And when we look at the science, you're going to see it's a bunch of hype, not a whole heck of a lot supporting it. Once again, we're going to address exactly what Lonnie Thompson does in his own presentations. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go and we're going to take a look behind the curtain. We're going to dig underneath the data. We're going to take a look at this data, the science, and we're going to ask you, does the conclusion reached by the global warming supporters match the data? Also, what I'd like you to do is visit, if you enjoy this video, go to www.theinternetskeptic.com. You'll be able to download this presentation. It'll have links to the underlying data. And more importantly, what I'd like you to do is click on that donate button. If I can just get everyone to donate $1 that watches this video, it'll go a long way towards making this into a documentary. Or donate the amount of a movie ticket, or a good comedy club ticket. Or donate whatever you'd like. But please visit www.theinternetskeptic.com and contribute if you enjoy this. Well, let's get started. This is one of my favorite quotes. Doesn't really have to do with the presentation, but it just adds a little humor. This comes from Dr. Fred Singer, president of the Science and Environmental Policy Project. He had invited Al Gore to come and give his presentation to his organization, and after the presentation, Al Gore comes up to him and goes, "Hey, what'd you think of the presentation?" And Dr. Singer goes, "Your presentation is very persuasive to anyone that doesn't know the science." And that's what we're going to show. I'm going to show that once you look into the science, the global warming theory, as expressed by the global warming theorists, doesn't hold water. This is the presentation that I'm going to be addressing. I went down to see this a few weeks ago down at the OSU, Ohio State University Mechanical Engineering Seminars. It was presenting Dr. Lonnie Thompson, distinguished. This was a distinguished university professor, the Byrd Polar Research Center, the United States University. His presentation was titled "Abrupt Climate Change, Past, Present, and Future." I think you can also do a Google search and find this out on the web. But remember, this is a distinguished university professor who's had many things published in peer-reviewed journals. Also in this presentation, I have some data from Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, a Skeptical Tour by Mario Lewis, Senior Fellow, Competitive Enterprise Institute. I used some of his data to support my claims. Okay. Well, what exactly does Lonnie Thompson say? If you listen to this, if you watch this video, you can listen to the WOSU interview after this, and he covers these claims. But let's go down and see what exactly does Lonnie Thompson claim in his presentations. He titles it "Why Contrarians Are Wrong, Balance of the Evidence." He claims the balance of the evidence skews towards him. He claims that the models predict and the data shows that A, stratosphere cools as surface warms. Variations in the sun's output would instead cause similar trends in the two atmospheric layers instead of opposite ones. We're going to take a look at that claim. 2, temperatures have warmed more at night than during the day. This is unlikely to be caused by some variability in the sun, for example, and appears to be linked to greenhouse gases that hold in heat radiating from the Earth's surface, even after sunset. We're going to take a look at that. 3, temperatures have risen more in winter than in summer. Opposite that would be expected if the sun was driving temperature increase. Okay. High latitudes have warmed more than low latitudes. Since more radiation is received at low latitudes, would expect the opposite if sun was driving change. Okay, so once again, high latitudes have warmed more than low latitudes. We're going to take a look at that claim. D, there has been a parallel warming trend over land and sea that increases the amount of heat. The increase in the amount of heat-trapping asphalt cannot be the only culprit. And what is that? F, several dozen top models have become progressively better at replicating climate patterns. And present, the only way to replicate the remarkable warming and extraordinary Arctic warming of the recent decade is to add greenhouse gases. Okay, those are the claims, and what we're going to do is we're going to simply take a look using their data and their claims, and we're going to see, does it hold water? Well, first off is the first one. Models predict and the data show that stratosphere cools as surface warms. Variations in the sun's output would instead cause similar trends in the two atmospheric layers instead of the opposite ones. First, that's not true. The sunlight travels through millions of miles of outer space without losing any energy and without warming it. Outer space is very cool. Okay, so that right off the bat doesn't hold any water. Second of all, let's take a look at the atmosphere. This graph right here, you can see, has water vapor concentration. The green, orange, and blue area, green, orange, and yellow areas is water vapor concentration. It ends just at the very bottom of what's called the stratosphere. So you don't really get any water vapor up into the stratosphere. This is called the troposphere, and that's where most of the water vapor is concentrated. But you can see there's a great deal of concentration of water vapor. Over here, what do you see? You see the temperature. So you have the latitude of the Earth, and then you have the altitude. And you can see as you go up, you have a warming area down here, then you have cooling, and then you have warming again. You have the ozone layer up here, trapping some of the IR radiation and heat. Then you have a very cool area in the stratosphere. Then you warm up again in the troposphere. Okay? The important thing to note here, though, is this pattern, this colored pattern, looks very much like that colored pattern. Well, you'd say that, you'd say, yeah, you're right. Interestingly, this is water vapor, that's temperature. Clearly, you can see water vapor is by far the most significant greenhouse gas. These two are almost perfectly correlated. Lonnie, however, will rarely, if ever, mention water vapor. When I saw him in the presentation, he only mentions it once he's been asked about it. If you listen to the WOSU presentation, he never mentions it. How can you forget to mention this? I have no idea. More importantly, if you look at this chart, this is CO2. CO2 is relatively evenly dispersed throughout all layers of the atmosphere. If it's due to CO2, wouldn't you have even warming throughout? But it's not. Heating is tied almost exactly to where the water vapor concentration is. Let's take a closer look. Once again, this is the temperature. You got the latitude, and you got the altitude, and you got temperature. Here you got the same thing, water vapor. Water vapor and temperature, they almost are, these are almost identical twins. You can put them right on top. Line them up next to each other, water vapor, temperature, they're almost identical. Most studies I've seen claim the water vapor, the greenhouse gas effect, is due to 95%. So water vapor can explain 95% of the greenhouse gas effect according to some of the studies I've seen. Okay? More importantly, once again, CO2 is evenly dispersed. Okay? You don't see an even dispersion of the temperature. Here you have the CO2 both in the southern and the northern hemisphere, and you can see the concentrations are relatively equal, both northern and southern hemisphere. More importantly, what you do, and this is my next project, you see that the northern hemisphere has a very volatile pattern of CO2 parts per million. Okay? What I'm going to do next is, and I think you can almost see it here, is the theory is that CO2 drives temperature. My theory is that temperature drives CO2. And I think what you see here is just that. Okay? You start to warm in June. Okay? Or you start to warm a little bit after June, maybe March and February. Okay? Where CO2 is still decreasing. Okay? Temperatures warm up, and by summertime you drive CO2 back up, and then it starts to cool when you go into the winter. But there's an annual cyclical pattern due to the Earth breathing in and out of CO2. And I think if you look at the lag time here, what you see is that temperature increases first. Okay, because even here, when temperatures are increasing after January, CO2 is dropping. Right? And then once you start to get into summertime, CO2 then starts to increase. So as you can see, CO2 starts to increase in June when the year's already been warming for probably about 3 or 4 months. So CO2 lags temperature, it doesn't lead it. This one is probably one of the most interesting and most damaging charts that I have. If you ever go see these presentations or listen to their lectures and arguments, it's not necessarily what they tell you, it's a lot of times what they don't tell you. Like Lonnie Thompson won't ever really mention the water vapor. He will rarely mention the sun, and if it is, it's to disprove it, not to really explore its contribution. Okay? This is an interesting chart that shows, we're talking about the stratosphere cooling, and sure enough, if you look at the charts that they have, shows stratospheric cooling. This is the areas of cooling. If you look real closely, they label this CO2 and O3. So when you look at this chart and you read it, you think, certainly CO2, increase in CO2 absorbs all the infrared radiation leading to cooling. That's how you read this chart. That's the way that they will portray it. Okay? Same thing with ozone. Ozone absorbs infrared radiation, prevents it from getting into the stratosphere, so you have a cooling in that band. That's what Lonnie Thompson means by stratosphere cooling, troposphere warming. But look at how to read this chart. This measures the wavelength of the light at which is being absorbed. Okay, now this is being done by S.A. Clark and M.J. Icono, 1995, Atmospheric and Environmental Research. These are the experts producing a chart like this, and they label it CO2 and ozone. Now when I present this, I can do a great job convincing an audience. Okay, if I showed you that, everybody in the audience is going, oh, yeah, you're right, CO2 is the culprit. The problem is the numbnuts gave you evidence that they don't want you to have. They gave you the wavelength. If you drop a perpendicular down, you see that what it runs into is 650 microns, or 6.5 microns. Right? Anyone have a problem with that? Most people wouldn't because they don't understand it. 6.5 microns happens to line up, and this is the IR absorption scale that has the wavelength and the absorption for the greenhouse gases. You got carbon dioxide and you have water vapor here. 6.5 microns happens to line up where? You got it at the extreme peak of water vapor absorption. This is nowhere near CO2 absorption. CO2 absorption, if you come down here, you see CO2 peaks at 2.7 microns and 4.3 microns. Nowhere near 6.3. 6.3 is right here. That's water vapor, not CO2. So they literally have to mislabel their charts in order to mislead you. Now you're saying, oh, wait a minute, Internet skeptic, you're going too far by saying that they're trying to deliberately mislead you. Yeah, you might, and that's a fair question. However, they labeled O3. O3, if you drop down, O3 happens to be ozone, falls right on 10 microns. You look down here, or I'm sorry, in the next chart, you'll see that ozone lines up right on 10 microns. So they can accurately label this one. They inaccurately label this one. They don't label it H2O, which they should, and they label it CO2. They're making their case with data that doesn't actually, that's basically, in my book, fraudulent. Okay? Once again, here is the IR absorption, and sure enough, here is ozone. Down here at 10, go right up, there's ozone, there's your peak. CO2, once again, 4.3, 2.7, nowhere near 6.5. This is water vapor right here where it flat lines, maximum absorption, that's where it lines up. So once again, this chart is mislabeled to make the case for CO2 when it really should be water vapor. Okay, it's easy to win arguments if you can simply manipulate data. Lonnie Thompson himself will show you a chart like this that shows areas of warming most rapidly. Now, if it's due to CO2, which is evenly dispersed, why do you have pockets of warming instead of evenly dispersion of warming over the entire world? He also makes the case that here's CO2 and methane over the past, and he predicts these spiking up of levels, and he claims that it's man producing all this additional methane. Well, if you remember right in your American history, the plains used to be covered with buffalo. Now, buffalo create a lot of methane, a lot of carbon, all right? So I'm not so sure that you can make the argument that man is producing a lot more CO2 and methane than used to be produced. I don't have any evidence for that, but I'm just suspicious of that. All right, let's go on to his next claim. Models predict and the data show that temperatures have warmed more at night than during the day. This is unlikely to be caused by some variability in the sun, for example, and appears linked to the greenhouse gases that hold in heat radiation from the Earth's surface even after sunset. Well, he's half right. Sure, that's what greenhouse gases do. They hold it in. We already saw that water vapor does that. We know water vapor does that. But he's claiming that it's not attributed to the sun. That, to me, demonstrates that Lonnie doesn't seem to understand a whole heck of a lot about the visible spectrum or the IR spectrum in general. This is what is called a Planck spectrum in Wien's law. What it basically says is that as you shorten the wavelength, you increase the energy. As you lengthen the wavelength, you decrease the energy. Why is that important here? Well, he claims it can't be due to the sun. Well, think about it. During the daytime, you're being exposed to the entire spectrum, the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Okay? You're getting, in white light, you're getting Roy G. Biv. Okay? You're getting a lot of blue light. Look at the sky, for God's sake. It's blue. You're getting a lot of blue light. Blue light has tremendous energy. This is the level of energy. This is the wavelength. And as you can see, blue light has a lot of energy. So it only takes a small increase of blue energy from the sun during the day to lead to a lot of increase in IR at night. It's not a linear relationship. If anything, it's probably logarithmic. You increase blue light a little bit during the day, you increase a lot of IR at night. Think about it this way. Think about a wavelength or light as a slinky. Blue light is if you take a slinky and you crunch it up. You got a lot of slinky in a very small area. Infrared is like you take that slinky and you stretch it out. So I could take about 10 compacted slinkies and fit it in one stretched out slinky, right? That's what blue light is. Blue light is 1 meter of blue light has about 10 meters of red light in it, just crunched up. So what happens is you have a small increase in output of the sun. The Earth absorbs that higher energy light during the day, and then at nighttime it simply has more infrared to release. So that's why you would expect a small change in the sun, because it's higher energy light, to be giving to more energy at night of infrared, which is lower energy. It's consistent with a warming of the sun. Just think about it this way. Think about it if you take a cup of hot coffee and pour it in a thermos, right? You measure the temperature after an hour or so. You're going to get a certain temperature. What happens if I increase the temperature of the coffee that I pour in there? Sure enough, a few hours later, you're going to measure it, and it'll be hotter than the other cup that was poured in that was cooler. That's all that's going on. Think of the Earth as a thermos. You're heating up the sun, which means that you're pouring in hotter coffee into the thermos. So it's not surprising that if you turn the lights off and measure it a few minutes later, it's a higher temperature. Okay? Lonnie just simply doesn't understand the electromagnetic spectrum and Planck's spectra and Wien's law. Here's an interesting thing. You got global monitoring, the accuracy of satellite data. Recently, much scientific debate has focused on the global temperature of the Earth's lower atmosphere as measured by by orbiting satellites. And while these data are exceedingly precise, verified by multiple satellite observations and balloon measurements taken in situ, they reveal no discernible warming trend in the Earth's lower atmosphere over the last 18 plus years. So according to NASA, according to rocket scientists, according to people with satellites and balloon measurements taken multiple times, these guys live for this kind of stuff. These are the engineers of the world. These aren't the, what is it, Lonnie Thompson, a geologist or something? Geography majors his wife. These are the engineers. These are the people who know high-level mathematics. And they're saying there's no global warming. These are the guys who build rockets and put them in on the moon, for God's sake. Okay? And they're saying there's no warming in the Earth's lower atmosphere over the last 18 plus years. You going to trust Lonnie or you going to trust NASA? I go with the rocket scientists. This is an actual, these are some actual slides that Lonnie uses in his presentation. And what I found interesting about this is, once again, it's how you present the data. And it's not necessarily what they say, it's what they don't say. When I look at these charts, over here you're showing measuring warmth. And they're showing that the change in annual temperatures with the 10 warmest in black. Okay, they're showing the most recent temperatures being the warmest. Okay? And then over here they say change in nighttime low temperatures. Once again, shows that they're increasing. And then over here they have change in stratospheric temperatures. Okay? And so clearly he's making the argument that 1, we're getting hotter, 2, the nighttime's getting warmer, and 3, the stratosphere is getting cooler. That's what these charts are supposed to imply. The problem is, you can't tell that from these charts. You're saying, wait a minute, Internet skeptic, I see it right with my own eyes. That's the problem, and that's why these people are so dangerous, is because they would give you something like that. They give you what they want you to see, but they don't want you to understand it. Look even closer. It says here, change in annual temperatures from 1901 to 2000 baseline. That is a 100-year baseline average. Of course you're going to get these big swings at the ends, at the polar ends. Okay, it's like taking an average weight of some guy over his entire lifetime. When he's an infant, you're way off the baseline. When he's 20s, he's way above it. Okay, but that's just simply the average of something increasing over 100 years. Okay? Once again, the baseline is 1901 to 2000. Go over here and you look at change in nighttime low temperatures. Now, once again, you're sitting there saying, okay, he's making the case. Look closely. This has a baseline of 1961 to 1990. So he shortened it for some reason. So he has a 100-year baseline to one that's barely 30 years, not 29-year baseline. So he's comparing apples and oranges. It even gets worse over here. Now the stratosphere, there's no long-term data on this stuff, okay? But what baseline does he use? 1984 to 96. So you have basically a 6-year baseline here, a 30-year baseline here, and a 100-year baseline here. He compares them all together and he says, here's my case. That, my friend, is junk science and lying with statistics. More importantly, this is supposedly one of the greatest global warming scientists out there. If you look down to the very right, where did he get it? You won't believe this. The New York Times. Okay? In my book, anyone who uses the New York Times as a credible source doesn't have a clue. Okay? And to be honest and to be fair, it says source National Climatic Data Center, University of Alabama, Huntsville. Even so, it comes there. The problem is the way they present it is misleading. They have different baselines comparing apples and oranges. Okay. Here's another one of his claims. Models predict and the data show that temperatures have risen more in winter than in summer. Opposite that would be expected if the sun was driving temperature increases. Once again, that's so doggone plausible. You sit there and you hear this. I sat in an audience of supposedly the greatest minds in the world at Ohio State University, this preeminent university of these great scholars. And he makes this claim and nobody raised an eyebrow. Okay? Problem is, it sounds so plausible. Yeah, in wintertime you get cooler. In summertime you get hotter. You'd expect the sun to be hotter in the summertime. That just sounds logical. The problem is, and once again we're in the northern hemisphere, the problem is, if you have to remember back to your elementary school science class, the Earth is closest to the sun in the wintertime. Perihelion, near the helion sun, occurs on January 3rd. We're the closest to the sun during the wintertime. So if you think about it, if we're closer to a hotter body, we would be getting hotter. That's logical. But because Lonnie weaves it this way, wintertime cold, oh, that makes sense, without thinking through the true physics of it, okay? You can see that Lonnie just simply doesn't understand that you're closer. If you doubt me, all you got to do is go upstairs, turn on a burner in your kitchen, take your hand and bring it closer to the burner. I guarantee you that as you get closer to the burner, your hand's going to get hotter. Okay? That's all that's going on here. So Lonnie, you're not disproving the sun, you're proving it. You're just doing it in a dishonest way. Models predict and data show that high latitudes have warmed more than low latitudes, since more radiation is received in the low latitude would expect the opposite if the sun was driving the force. Once again, he makes this claim, but think about the logic of it. If CO2 is trapping radiation and causing warming, wouldn't that lead to the fact that if you have more light to absorb, that would be warming? He right here claims, and he shows that CO2 is evenly dispersed around the globe, and yet he's saying where most of the light comes in, that where most of the light can be trapped, it's not warming, it's cooling relative to the northern hemisphere. That disproves CO2, doesn't prove it, and that makes sense for the sun. It doesn't not make sense for the sun, because when we see what's going on, we forget about CO2, we look at precipitation, and lo and behold, we're going to see a different story. But remember, he claims it can't be due to the sun. If it was being caused by CO2, it would be warming the areas where most of the sun comes in. And once again, here is the CO2 levels in both northern and southern hemisphere, equally distributed throughout. Once again, that cyclical pattern shows that temperature drives CO2 because CO2 doesn't start increasing until June or so. Okay? The Earth had been heating up since probably February or March. So CO2 lags temperature. Let's take a look at what's really going on. Why then, Lonnie, or I'm sure the listeners are saying, why then is the northern hemisphere warming and the southern hemisphere is cooling? Which also brings up another good point. We don't have global warming. We have northern hemisphere warming, and southern hemisphere cooling. So at best you can say we have northern hemisphere warming. You cannot say we have global warming. Well, lo and behold, look here. Here we have temperature change per decade. And where are all the red areas? Up here in the top. The northern hemisphere has the highest precipitation changes. Lo and behold, where water vapor increased, the temperature increased. Lonnie, why don't you ever mention water vapor? Then let's take a look down here. Precipitation change in the past decade. Once again, the yellows are the high increase in precipitation. High increase in precipitation up in the top. High temperature increase. Okay. Interesting though, The brown areas are where there is very low precipitation. Note here these little brown spots here and over here. We're going to get back to that, but remember I said something about the precipitation levels later on in this presentation. Also remember the southern hemisphere is cooling. Remember those 2 points. This one kind of gets to it. Once again, if CO2 is evenly dispersed throughout the atmosphere, why do you have temperature anomalies that are mostly in the northern hemisphere, not the southern, if CO2 is equally? Also, again, once again, if the sun is hitting down here in the lower atmosphere, the lower latitudes, why don't you have heating down here? Because there'd be more light for CO2 to be trapped. Okay? Once again, I'm pointing here. You see this little gray area? That gray area is surface temperature anomaly. If you look for the gray, that's in the cooling area. Remember that little gray area, that little point. We're getting to it. Okay? Models predict and data show that there has been a parallel warming trend over land and oceans. The increase in the amount of heat-trapping asphalt cannot be the culprit. Okay? Well, once again, there may be if there is a parallel warming. Okay? Well, what is occurring uniformly across the globe? The sunlight, right? You got day and night. So once again, that is supportive of the sun. The sun would warm things universally, or you'd have a parallel shift in temperature because you're getting more light coming in there. I don't understand how that works against the sun. Okay. What else can I say about that? That's about it. But bottom line is the sun would explain an even warming. Okay. Models predict and data show that several dozen top models have become progressively better at replicating climate patterns and present. The only way to replicate the remarkable warming and the extraordinary Arctic warming, we're going to remember what he says, extraordinary Arctic warming, of the recent decade is to add greenhouse gases. My first comment here is several dozen top models have become progressively better. Well, what do the other several dozen top models show? Okay? It sounds to me like there's a bunch of models out there and they all conflict. And if you have a bunch of conflicting models, first of all, how can you have a consensus? Are these people that run those other models not being peer-reviewed, or do their opinions not count? Or do you simply pick the top ones to make your arguments on? Okay? Second of all, if you look here, you'll see that their model, which is gray, doesn't do a very good job explaining the red line, which is what they say is the supposed temperature anomaly. Okay, this is without man's contribution, that gray line. It doesn't do a very good job. You throw man's contribution on, and suddenly it becomes a better fit. Okay? If you notice here, this means that man must not have had any, I mean, here's a warming period, but man didn't have any impact here. For some reason, after 1970, man suddenly became a big major factor, because that's where it turns up. So man, according to their own models, had no impact prior to 1970. Then after 1970, it became basically the most significant variable that dominated the model. That doesn't make any sense, especially if you understand these modeling. I will tell you how you can do that, though. I guarantee you if I had taken the height of a tree that I planted in 1970, threw it in this model, I would get that same kind of result. That's called multi-collinearity. There's a whole bunch of things you can play around with to get these models to give you the answers they want. But the fact is, prior to 1970, their model says man didn't do anything. Post-1970, man was almost, man, literally, this is flat. Man is 100% responsible for after post-70. But man's been producing carbon for years. So right there, their model's suspect. Okay? Down here, when you put man and nature together, it fits pretty doggone well. That, to me, it's junk science. I could go out there and run a study on weight loss and show that weight loss is a function of tennis shoes, right? Because most people wear tennis shoes when they exercise. I could run that model and get to that kind of result, but it doesn't mean tennis shoes cause you to lose weight. That's just simply what's called multi-collinearity. They were playing around with the numbers, their variables, and things like that. Here's even another example. This one gets a little complicated. This you have temperature and CO2. CO2 is the red and yellow, and the temperature is the blue. First you ask me, why do you have temperature red and yellow? Well, ironically, the red is from ice cores down in the Arctic, drilled from sea level in an area that's surrounded by ice. Yellow is from the top, not sea level, but 14,000 feet. It's the top of Mauna Loa, a CO2 spewing volcano surrounded by CO2 spewing oceans. They combine two totally dissimilar data sets to create their CO2 chart. Look over here, this black line is the rate of ascent, or the slope, of the CO2 for the ice core. Over here is the slope for CO2 from Mauna Loa. Clearly it doglegs. I would think immediately that something's wrong with my data set when I see a dogleg like that. I mean, it just happens to dogleg right where you merge the two data sets. That would ring a bell to me immediately, but not to these guys. Okay, well, the slopes change, meaning the rate of an increase in CO2 rapidly increases. However, here's a period of increasing temperatures. Here's a period of increasing temperatures. If you take the slope, you'll see that the slope for both those periods is identical, or nearly identical, meaning that an increase in temperature at a rapid rate did not lead to an increase in rate of temperature increase. If CO2 drove temperature, wouldn't you think an increasing rate of CO2 would lead to an increasing rate of temperature? It doesn't. More importantly, CO2 was being produced between 1940 and 1980 also, right? And yet temperatures fell. So even though CO2 was not only increasing, but increasing at an increasing rate, temperatures were falling during that period. Once again, how does CO2 cause this? All right, well, talk about, in normal science, you talk about controls. You want to control as many factors as possible. Well, you saw with the CO2, they use Antarctica, then they use Mauna Loa. You couldn't find more dissimilar data sets. There was absolutely nothing controlled there. They varied everything. In economics, we call it ceteris paribus. Well, they blew that rule out of the water. Here you have, let's go back and just say normal science. You typically want to maintain a consistent measurement style. Well, let's say, if we're going to go measure temperature, what would we want to use to measure temperature? Let me think. Tree rings? Nah. Coral? Nah. Ice cores? Nah. I got it. Why don't we use something as crazy? Here's a wacky idea. Why don't we use thermometers to measure temperature? Who would have ever thunk of that? Someone's going to actually use a temperature to measure thermometer to measure temperatures. Lo and behold, someone actually does that. If you look at the hockey stick chart, they use coral rings, tree rings, ice cores, everything but thermometers till you get into the 1900s. Well, here's a temperature reading, the longest continuous, consistent measure of temperature reading in the northern hemisphere. Albany, New York. They use a thermometer from the same spot, same methodology for over 150 years. And you know what? Back in 1822, what was the average temperature? 49.2. What was the average temperature in 2005? 49.2. Now, what does that really show you? Not much. Just 2 points in time had the equal average. They do show no warming, at least for those 2 years. The way you really do this is you go to this website, you download the data, and you run a regression. If you run a regression on it, you know what it shows? The slope is down. We've been cooling, according to the longest continuous recorded history using thermometers in the northern hemisphere. Temperatures have been cooling. So if I use that data set, I can say temperatures have been cooling. More importantly, Lonnie Thompson downplays the sun. Well, lo and behold, if you take a look here at this chart, you see that sunspots correlate very well with temperature. Down here is CO2, and you can see CO2 rapidly increases throughout, and yet temperature's up and down. So there's a very little relationship between this CO2 chart and temperature. However, these sunspots and temperature overlap extremely well. I'd be willing to bet you get an R squared of 0.8 or 0.9 on that thing. You get no R squared if you use carbon dioxide. Same study here shows the same thing. More importantly, if you look over here, it shows the solar cycle 24 prediction. What it shows, though, is that the solar cycle is going to bottom about 2008. Okay? And lo and behold, what are we getting here in Columbus, Ohio? One of the coolest winters we've had in decades. Record low temperatures have been set all over the country, tied to solar sunspots. My willing to bet is 2008 and 9 are going to be even colder. Okay? Internet skeptics going out on a limb saying, according to this prediction, we're going to totally ignore CO2, and I'm willing to bet we get colder winters for the next 2 years. Over here, what does it say? Guess what? The sun is warmer now than in the past 11,400 years. Well, guess what? The sun's hitting a record high in temperature, and we're warming too? Lo and behold, how crazy is that? Of course, Lonnie rules out the sun. I mean, he looks at a chart like this and says, that doesn't make any sense. But if you correlate that with that, that makes a lot of sense. How? I mean, no one who has an unbiased eye would look there and say, you got a better fit with CO2 than temperature than you do sunspots and temperature. I mean, no scientist would do that, is my opinion. Once again, you can see the annual site variations. Once again, it starts to turn up in June, well after the year has been heating. I find this interesting because both Lonnie and Al Gore use the same type of a chart. This is supposedly CO2. Well, CO2 is invisible. It's what you exhale. It happens to be plant food. It's airborne fertilizer. Okay? People seem to forget that without CO2, plants die. Okay? We fertilize food with that. Due to the increase in CO2, we've been able to feed far more people because our yields have been much greater. Okay? So the question you need to ask is, what happens if we yank all that CO2 out? Are we going to start starving people? And the answer is yes. People starve during ice ages. They don't starve during warming periods. Okay, here you got Common Sense 101. If CO2 is 25% higher than at any time before in history, why isn't temperature anywhere near an all-time high? That's the problem they've got. They keep saying CO2 drives temperature. They keep showing you these charts of CO2 at these record levels of 380 parts per million, and yet their temperature charts don't show us anywhere near an all-time high. Go figure. Once again, someone's not doing well in basic science. And here's what I'm talking about. Al Gore shows this chart in his movie. He shows CO2 hitting record highs. Okay? According to these charts, we're at basically a record high. We've never seen a period before where we have 380 parts per million of CO2. Unfortunate for Al Gore is he puts CO2 on top of a temperature graph. Right? Don't you think Al Gore would be smart enough to take a look at the chart that he publishes and puts in his movie? I mean, did anyone bother? I mean, remember this is peer-reviewed stuff? Didn't these peer-reviewed people take a look at this stuff and say, hey, Al, you're kind of not making your case here? Because let's take a closer look. Here's a temperature chart. You got peak 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Here's the temperature, or CO2. CO2 is at record high. It's actually at 380. Okay? But take a look. This peak is higher than the current peak. This peak is higher than the current peak. This peak is higher than the current peak. This peak. Every previous peak labeled is higher than the previous peak as far as temperature goes. So we're nowhere near an all-time high in temperature according to Lonnie Thompson's own chart. Okay? And yet CO2 is blowing away. Why wouldn't CO2 be a record high if CO2 is, if they were related? It's not. More importantly, let's take even a closer look. You know, I keep saying they have temperature charts all over the place. Zoom in on it and you see temperatures have been falling from the most recent peak. Not only that, we've been falling from the most recent peak. Okay? This is a downtrend. While during a period where CO2 is rapidly increased, their charts don't even make their case. When I keep saying they have multiple charts for temperature. Al Gore's own movie, he uses the hockey stick chart, but he just uses the chart I just showed you. They have multiple charts. So how in the world can you have any kind of a model if you haven't even agreed upon your dependent variable? That makes no sense at all. They don't even know what they're talking about. They can't even tell you what the accurate temperatures were. And yet they've got a model that predicts it? If you don't even have accurate data, how can you have an accurate prediction? If you know anything about modeling and forecasting, that's absolute insanity what they're claiming. Let's take even a closer look. Let's take a look at their CO2 and temperature charts. Does CO2 lead temperature? Does it drive it? Well, take a look here. This is basically just takes one of these periods of their chart and blows it up. And you can see during periods of record high CO2, CO2 stays at record highs, temperatures plummet. Okay? It's only after temperatures are plummeted does CO2 come down. Temperatures lead CO2. They don't trail it. CO2 is the dependent variable, not the independent variable. They've got everything backwards. Temperature drives CO2. CO2 does not drive temperature. Their own chart proves it. Okay? This is like saying if CO2 caused it, it's like water boils today and I turn the burner on 100 years from now. Or in reality, 8 to 1400 years later. That's not the way it works. Temperature changes first and then CO2. Cause, effect. They've got their cause and effect backwards. Okay? This comes from Competitive Enterprise Institute, and it addresses CO2 as a pollutant. An Inconvenient Truth never mentions that CO2 is plant food and aerial fertilizer. A rising CO2 levels helps trees, crops, and green things generally grow faster and larger, produce more fruit, use water more efficiently, and resist pollution stress. Experimental data indicates that 100 pounds per million increase in CO2 levels since pre-industrial times has increased average yield by 60% for wheat, 33% for fruits and melons, and 51% for vegetables, an extraordinary positive externality courtesy of the Industrial Revolution. Once again, global warming, atmospheric CO2 feeds people. That's a good thing. He's also pointing out that you can't see CO2 and yet they keep using these charts. Okay? Let's take a look. Here's the carbon dioxide. Once again, you got ice core, and then you got Mauna Loa. Two totally different data sets, yet they combine them together and claim that they're equal. This is 14,000 feet. That's sea level. This is surrounded by a CO2 spewing volcano. That one's not. Okay. If you take a look at it, this is an ice core data. This is a proxy. Okay. This is a flash data. They go out and cap it. So this is a direct measurement. So you got core, proxy versus flash direct. My question is, why don't they take flash data from this same area? Why did they go halfway around the world and up 14,000 feet to get their flash data? Why didn't they just stay there instead of drill a core, take an air graph sample? That's my question. Why don't they do that? Sea level, this is sea level, this is 13,700 feet. This is tropical, this is the Arctic. This is a CO2 spewing volcano. This has no biomass at all. You couldn't, I mean, if you talk about controlling for factors, okay, there's no controls at all. They deliberately chosen the most dissimilar spots in the world. There's nothing similar about these two spots, and yet they combine samples from the same thing. That's like taking a urine sample from a fat man and comparing it to a skinny woman and saying, okay, that's equal. It makes no sense. Data contamination, I think she gave me cooties. Just think about what's going on here. Okay? This is what's going on out in Hawaii. You got these hippies, these smelly hippies out there smoking the ganja. You got trucks all over the place. I used to live out there. You got this H1 highway. You can go 1 mile in 3 hours. Okay? You got jets out there like it's a bus system. They got Aloha Airlines. They got Mahalo Airlines. It's like it's a taxi service between the islands. They got jets flying all around up in the area, spewing out CO2 where they're taking these flash samples. You know, I bet these guys watch jets fly over them every day. That diffuses down. It's like dropping dye into a water. It's very highly concentrated where it first hits and then dilutes out. So this is a high concentration of CO2 that they're grabbing. You've also got cars out there. You've got basically, you got Pearl Harbor out there. You got huge ships out there. You got cars. Okay? This is a lot of pollution, and they're just simply air-grabbing pollution. This is the Arctic. I don't see anything polluting down there. I don't see any CO2 producing stuff other than the ocean. Right? Okay, and yet they're claiming this is the same data set as that. Think about it, guys. They should get those guys off that Mauna Loa and get them down here grabbing air grab samples. This is a chart that used by both John Hart and Lonnie Thompson in their presentations. It shows man's consumption of petroleum coincident with the increase in CO2. They're claiming that man burning CO2, burning petroleum leads to CO2. They also say the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide is primarily due to world energy consumption and secondarily due to deforestation. That's what they complain. It's all man's fault. One thing also I want to remind you of, CO2 makes up only 4 or 5% of the atmosphere, period. CO2 is a trace gas. Man produces only 5% of that 5%, if that. Okay? So you can see man produces only a sliver of a fractional gas. All right. Well, this is where I have another big problem with Lonnie Thompson's statements. Models predict and data shows that and he says it shows that they've got these models. Well, the problem is, in order to have a model, I don't care if you have the Cray, the most top of the line Cray supercomputer, if you don't have accurate data to put into it, your computer's irrelevant. Okay. Well, the problem is, this is 1996. This is the IPCC chart for temperature. Clearly, it's cyclical. It shows the medieval warming period, the Little Ice Age, and the recent temperatures are way below the peak, just of the last 1,000 or so years. Okay? That's what you saw in 1996. The problem is, this doesn't make the case for man-made global warming. This shows you that you're just getting back to normal from the Little Ice Age. So you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, doggone, we've got an election coming up. We've got to get Al Gore in the White House. How are we going to do that? I got it. Let's rewrite history. Just like in 1984 where that guy's job was to rewrite history. They say, let's get rid of this temperature chart and let's replace it with this. A linear chart. Okay? Curvilinear, linear. Then you get the spike over here with what's called the hockey stick chart. Now it makes sense why you plug this data in to that model, why you can get man to explain most of it. Okay? You got linear, then it spikes up, just like that model we saw earlier. Okay? But the key is, how can you go in a period of 5 years, go from this to this, and they've reached a consensus on that. Science doesn't move that fast. This to me is debatable. So how can you would think that you'd have half the scientists defending the old model, or the old one. You got this tyranny of the status quo in the scientific field. This isn't tyranny of the status quo, this is jump on the bandwagon. Follow the leader. Oh, if Lonnie Thompson says this, we all agree. Why? Because if we don't agree here, we lose our funding. Okay? But this chart's nowhere near this. More importantly, it shows no medieval warming period and no Little Ice Age. That's the important thing about the hockey stick chart. No medieval warming period, no Little Ice Age. Now, here's the problem. You got a computer model that you tell me, or you have any kind of a model. Temperature is your Y, according to their model. How in the world, and this is, I know it's simplified, I know this is linear, I know you can have curvilinear, I know you can have multiple regression, you can have multiple X's, I know all that. This is for general consumption. Okay? Try if this is for a elementary school or middle school science class. Y equals mx plus b. Temperature is your y, CO2 is your x. The problem is you cannot have an equation that can explain both these functions. Whatever data you put in for this that explains this will not explain that. If it explains this, it won't explain that. So until you've decided on your dependent variable, your temperature data, you cannot have a valid model. And you certainly cannot have a consensus if global warming is a true science. Now, if you're willing to ignore stuff like this and make global warming a religion, then you buy into this. This is not science. This is junk science. You cannot explain both those with a function. More importantly, these cover the same time periods. You cannot have an average temperature of this and an average temperature of this for the same year. It makes no sense. You're either this or that. You can't be both. Once again, I just wanted to show you the modeling. As soon as you threw that little spot in there, sure enough, the model works. Okay? Flat, flat, spike, spike, the model works. The key is you throw in that other chart, and this thing really breaks down. It's all dependent upon what data you choose to put into the model. And remember, they're showing in their model the warming. NASA says there's no warming. So once again, what temperature chart are you referring to when you say there's global warming? Ironically, Lonnie Thompson himself, he uses the hockey stick chart, and then he has another slide where he talks about one of his glaciers that is labeled Little Ice Age in the medieval warming period. So he admits it here that it exists, and then he uses a chart that shows that it doesn't exist. What kind of logic is this? Okay, I'm going to explain it here, and then I'm going to use this chart that doesn't show it. Then I'll show this chart that shows that it exists. Then I'll say, okay, imagine it doesn't. This is like that giant elephant in the living room no one wants to talk about. If it exists, it exists. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But you can't say both. Okay? Once again, here's this chart. And once again, here's the hockey stick chart. They use tree rings, coral, lakes, ice, ocean, and ice cores. Why don't you think of using a thermometer, for God's sake? It was developed in 1412 or something, or 1712. So you have temperature data all the way back here. Why are you using tree rings, coral, lake, ocean, and ice cores? Multiple proxies. They don't even use direct measurements. That's junk science. If you have a direct measurement of a thermometer, you use it. You don't use proxies. Everyone knows that. That's common sense. Here's another chart that Lonnie Thompson uses, and this one shows cooling temperatures over the most recent time period. So which one is it, Lonnie? Are we warming? Are we flat? Warming or cooling? Here's your cooling. You showed us one that we were warming, and one showed us they were flat with a recent spurt. Which temperature chart are you putting into these models? I challenge anyone with any kind of a mathematical background to try to explain to me what these people are doing. Once again, Al Gore's got the two charts. There's your model. Which temperature data do they use? None of this makes any sense. You plug in, depending on what temperature data you use, you're going to get a totally different result. Okay? Once again, when Lonnie Thompson uses when he decides to exaggerate the results, what temperature chart does he decide to use? The hockey stick. This is the most discredited temperature chart out there. In fact, my understanding in the new 1997 version of the IPCC report, they don't even use it anymore. And yet Lonnie keeps using a chart that's not even in the IPCC report anymore. Now, remember what I just said. My understanding, it's been published that they're not going to be using it. Okay? If it turns out that they do put it in it, that's fine. But the fact is, it's undecided on what temperature chart to use. Okay, now remember, Lonnie Thompson, he uses, this is a big thing about the Larsen B shelf breaking off. Well, he forgot to tell you that, remember, the southern hemisphere is cooling. So this area of the globe is actually cooling. This one area happens to be warming due to water current circulation, but that has nothing to do with global warming. Okay? Arctic itself is cooling. Okay? Temperatures in the peninsula region have warmed by 2 degrees Celsius in the past 50 years. Yes, Lonnie, that's due to water current. You know that. The rest of Antarctica has been cooling. Okay? The Arctic ice cap is actually thickening. Here's the temperature of the southern hemisphere. It's cooling. So these ice caps are breaking apart in the area where you have global cooling. So if anything, he's making the case that global cooling is causing the breakup of these glaciers. Okay? And you could actually make a case for that. Why? Because the Arctic ice cap is thickening because it's cooler, it's forming more ice, that ice pushes the ice out, and this is what's called calving. Okay? So believe it or not, that's actually normal from what you'd expect from a cooling area. Because the Arctic ice cap is thickening, it pushes outward, and it basically calves off big ice cores. Okay? Okay, 2 new studies in 2006 showed overall volumes of ice in the Arctic appear to be declining. Okay? Okay? This is what the American Enterprise Institute says. Gore alludes to this one study, Valcona and War. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. The study shows that volume is declining only in the smaller West Arctic ice sheets. Okay? In more recent study, Wingham et al. Finds an overall increase in Arctic ice mass during the 93 to 2003 period. Okay? So actually, you can actually see an increase in the Arctic ice mass in the most recent study. This is showing a decrease, and that's the one Al Gore goes from. Okay? Here's actually what's going on. It's a water current problem. The water from the middle ocean flushes underneath the glacier and melts it. Okay? The West Arctic ice sheet melted or slipped off its mooring into the sea. It would raise sea levels worldwide by 20 feet. That's the claim by Al Gore. An inconvenient truth provides no information allowing us to assess whether the structural changes are significant or alarming. Probably refers to NASA's research showing that water at mid-depth, the warmest layer in the polar oceans. The study says warming arrives from lower altitudes, been increasing this mid-layer water temperature only a fraction of a degree. Implication, this process occurs with or without global warming and cannot be stopped. This has to do with water temperature, not global warming. Here are some other interesting. Now remember back in the previous charts I pointed out, remember those brown spots? Remember the areas where water vapor has been decreasing and it's getting drier? Well, those areas are right where, guess what, Lonnie Thompson happens to do his research. He seems to pick the arid areas to do his glacier research. And he seems to report on them a lot. Here's the glacier in 77. Here's the glacier in 2002. What do you notice here? It's dry as a bone. Why is it dry as a bone? Because it's not melting, it's evaporating. Okay? This is a dry, this is like a freeze-dried coffee. You blow dry air across ice, it evaporates. Okay? Once again, look here, it's the arid areas, the very dry areas. And remember, it's in the southern hemisphere. Remember, according to Lonnie Thompson, the southern hemisphere is cooling. But once again, it's the dry areas, and it's actually, this area shows cooling. Blue, it's cooling. So these glaciers are actually in areas where it's cooling and it's dry. So it's not evaporating, it's not melting, it's evaporating. Okay? Once again, you pull out the water vapor, it's cooling. Here again is where this blue area is where the Kilimanjaro is, that's cooling. Okay, over here, where you got the white and the yellow, that's where the other South American glaciers are. Here he shows the Himalayas, right? When I look at this, I get scared. I'm thinking, oh my God, and here's some water. I can finally say, look, it's actually melting. That's the Himalayas. When I see that, I get pretty scared. But you know what? I went to Wikipedia. That's the Himalayas. There's a lot of ice there that's not even being touched. Lonnie's probably down here with his camera right at the very edge. It's kind of like going to a ski resort. You go to a ski resort in the summer, there's no snow there. You go there in the wintertime, there's plenty of snow. Okay? Look at this thing. You tell me that thing's melting, Lonnie? That's a huge area. And this picture was taken in November 25, 2005. There's a lot of glacier there. He may be down here getting his photos, but clearly there's a lot of glacier left in Nepal. And once again, you point the arrow there, it's in this area right here, the very light temperature increase near the white area, so it's debatable whether that area is actually even warming. Here you got the glacier Llano Norte, okay? Once again, in 1896, here it is in 2001. I just wonder where he gets these photos, because when I go look them up, look what I see. I see a lot of ice, okay? He's very good at his selective photos, okay? Because this photo was taken 2006, 2/12. That looks like a lot of ice and a big glacier to me. Sorry. Mount Kilimanjaro, this is probably the biggest one. Lonnie claims that this is melting due to global warming. There's plenty of research that proves otherwise, though. But let's take a look at his own data. Okay? First of all, I showed you that that's actually a dry, cooling area. Okay, second, temperatures have been increasing for the last decade, or since the industrial era, or CO2's been going up during that period. And yet the rate of glacier decrease has not been increasing. In fact, it's been slowing. So if we've been warming recently, his slope here is changing, decreasing. Now that's kilometers squared. Okay? So the rate of decrease has been decreasing. Okay? Wouldn't you expect this to be? If I took an ice cube and put it on a burner and turned up the heat, wouldn't it melt faster, not slower, as you increase the temperature? Well, it's not been melting any faster. Okay? That's the problem. It's been basically evaporating away. Okay? Once again, it's right there where it's nice and cool. Okay? That red area shows the country, not temperature. That's the temperature, and it's cooling. And it's dry. The French, I mean, my gosh, when did you ever think I'd have the French come to my rescue? Well, even this one. Decorated scientist defects from belief in global warming. Caps year of vindication for skeptics. Or as Lonnie Thompson would call them, deniers. Okay? One of the most decorated French geophysicists has converted from a believer in man-made catastrophic global warming to a climate skeptic. And he points out that, sure enough, Kilimanjaro's not melting, it's evaporating. It has to do with humidity changes, not temperature changes. But don't listen to me. The French, the liberals love French. Listen to this guy. Once again, snows have been decreasing since 1880, where there's no evidence of a significant temperature change at the end of the 19th century. The 20th century does not exhibit a uniform warming signal. Once again, temperature, the decrease has actually been decreasing, and yet CO2 has been shooting through the roof. So during a period where CO2 has been increasing, the rate of decline has been shrinking. More snow disappeared before Hemingway published his famous novel in 1903 than after it. That's kind of a scale argument also, though. There just simply was more ice to evaporate. In 1880, CO2 levels were approximately 290, only slightly above pre-industrial levels of 280, and that's when it was melting. Okay. Even in recent decades, there's been virtually no warming in the Kilimanjaro summit. This is the temperature reading showing no warming, actually cooling recently. Okay, satellite measurements of the air temperature of Kilimanjaro show a trend of 0.01 Celsius since decades since 1978, essentially zero. Rather than changes, bottom line is it hasn't been warming at the peaks of Kilimanjaro, and yet the glaciers are evaporating. The more important question is, Lonnie should be asking is, don't try to prove that warming's doing it. Find out what's causing it, so maybe you can do something about it. That's the problem with these activists. They don't look for the solution. Once again, here it is. Okay, this glacier is disappearing. It's bone dry. It's evaporating. It is not melting. Okay, well, if you look at it, you don't see a drop of water anywhere. This is Mount Kilimanjaro. Once again, it's bone dry. What's going on? This glacier is not melting. It is evaporating. That is, unless my eyes are lying to me, but that looks pretty dry. That looks real dusty, and that looks to me like it's evaporating. It's just like freeze-dried coffee. You freeze it, you blow air over it. Anyone who's ever been in one of those water preservation situations, you know, where they might flood a library, well, that's how they save the books. They freeze the books and they freeze dry them. Okay? There's Lonnie once again. If this was melting, wouldn't Lonnie be standing in a pile of mud? He's not. He's standing on bone dry stuff. And they're saying global warming's taking this away from me. No, it's not, Lonnie. It's the wind blowing by that thing and it's evaporating. There's some freeze-dried diced apples. It's a simple process. It's called freeze-drying. Okay? Lonnie makes this comment about glaciers are the canaries in the coal mine. Well, we heard that about the frogs also. He says global glacier retreat at the beginning of the 21st century is driven mainly by increasing temperatures. I've shown you that that's not true. It's due to drier air. The glaciers that he's examining and showing that are disappearing are in the southern hemisphere. That's cooling. The problem is it's drying there. So you've got cooling, drying temperatures. Okay? Once again, we're provided with don't let the facts stand in the way. Once again, southern hemisphere. See where he labels all these? We already showed that Kilimanjaro was cooling but drier. Okay? Southern hemisphere, cooling but drier. Right? This, what I love here, is he has undetermined. You know, this is changes in the ice cover. Right there it says Arctic ice cap is thickening, and yet Lonnie will label it with a question mark. What's the question about it? I mean, they've pretty much proven that it's increasing. Your little peninsula there, and, you know, does CO2 suddenly shoot up here for some reason, and then not over here? I mean, why do you have this dissimilar warming trend if it's due to CO2? Okay. All right, he also claims that there's a water, these populations depend upon the water source of the glacier. Well, if that's true, that the glacier's been melting for a long enough period that societies have developed around it, that to me tells me that you've had melting for quite some time. Civilizations have evolved around it. But more importantly, it's the societies depend upon the snow cover and the melting of snow, not the glaciers. Okay, and as you can see, the Eurasian snow cover has not been decreasing. Okay, the loss of nature's water towers. Once again, people don't live off the glacier water, and if they have been, that just shows you glaciers have been melting annually for long times, and that throws into question your layering theory. But once again, the decrease in Kilimanjaro has actually been decreasing. Okay. Ice on Earth. Ice covers about 10% of the Earth's continental area. Most of that ice, more than 32 million cubic kilometers, surrounds Antarctica, Greenland, but around 100,000 cubic kilometers are locked in the glacier mountains. Okay. Sea level rise due to melting glaciers and thermal expansion of the oceans. Alpine glaciers melting and thermal expansion of the world's oceans will raise sea levels by 0.5 meter, displacing over 100 million people. Okay? Sounds pretty frightening. Okay? Sea level is currently rising at 3 millimeters per year. Figure out how many years it's going to take at a rise of 3 millimeters to raise half a meter. A millimeter is 1/1000th of a meter. Centimeter is 1/100th. Okay, so to get to half a millimeter, or half a meter, it's going to take a lot of years at 3 millimeters per year. And that's due to thermal expansion of the oceans, alpine glacier mass loss, ice sheet mass loss, and pumping groundwater irrigation. Okay, don't have anything to argue with that. But once again, here is the glacier, the big chunks of ice. Okay, and this is from Al Gore's movie. You can see that they get this. There goes New Orleans. Okay, there goes Manhattan. Okay. Well, here's some. This comes from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Okay, if Greenland melted or broke up and slipped into the sea, or if half of Greenland and half of the Arctic melted or broke up and slipped into the sea, sea levels worldwide would increase between 18 and 20 feet. That's from An Inconvenient Truth. Well, let's look at the facts. The Greenland ice sheet cannot slip into the sea, since it is resting in a bowl-shaped depression produced by its own weight, surrounded by mountains which permit only limited glacier outflow to the sea. So right off the bat, you don't have to worry too much about Greenland. And by the way, remember, the Vikings used to farm in Greenland. So just within the last 2,000 years or so, it's been warm enough for the people to be farming up there. To melt half of Greenland's ice sheet and raise sea levels by 3 meters would require additional sustained warmth of 5.5 degrees Celsius over 1,000 years. Okay? I think we'd have enough time to adjust in 1,000 years. Okay. How alarming is the current ice loss rate of Greenland? Greenland's glaciers are thickening in the interior and thickening on the edges. Okay, Greenland lost 1.101 gigatons per year of ice. That's from 2003 to 2005, contributing 0.28 millimeters per year of sea level rise, a little more than 1 inch per century. That's not apocalypse. Okay, how alarming is the overall ice loss rate? Sea level measurements, or satellite measurements of the ice mass changes in Greenland, East Antarctica, and West Antarctica during 1992 to 2002 showed a combined ice loss sea level rise equivalent to 0.05 millimeter, not half a millimeter, 0.05. Take a half and divide it by 10 per year. That's nothing. Okay, absolutely nothing. At that rate, it would take a full millennium to raise sea levels by just 5 centimeters, and take fully, now 5 centimeters is nowhere near half a meter, okay, and fully take 20,000 years to raise it a single meter. So there's 10,000 years to get to those numbers at these rates, okay? All hype and there's nothing behind this stuff. Okay, Lonnie will come up with society has 3 options: prevention, adaptation, and suffering. The adverse effect, down here it's suffering, the adverse impact that are not avoided by either mitigation or adaptation, okay? Bottom line is, if you yank CO2 out of the atmosphere, you're going to get a lot of starving people, and they will starve, okay? This is some of the stuff that comes from Al Gore's movie, and Lonnie Thompson uses this in his presentation. These hyped up words: crisis, danger, opportunity. Okay, what kind of a science does this kind of stuff in his presentation? Crisis, be alarmed, woo! Danger, watch out. Okay, opportunity. Okay, this is the kind of stuff, once again, you see in Al Gore's movie. I wouldn't expect it in a presentation from one of the supposedly greatest global warming scientists in the world. And they always use this thin veil Earth and things. Key points made in this presentation. The Earth is at its warmest since record keeping began in 1860. Once again, I ask you, what chart are you using? The 20th century is the warmest in the last 2,000 years. The 1996 IPCC chart shows totally different. Okay, so once again, what chart are you referring to? There is broad scientific consensus that human activities are contributing to the warming of the Earth and creating systematic disruptions. Okay, broad scientific consensus. Right? If they have a consensus on this kind of science, science is no longer science; it is a religion. No way should the errors that I've pointed out you should ever be able to reach scientific consensus. Ice cores provide unique information that extends our knowledge of the Earth's climate history. No argument there. Glaciers, the most part of the world, are rapidly melting, and the loss will affect 2.3 billion people, and valuable paleoclimate archives will be lost forever. Once again, your glaciers are evaporating; they're not melting. Glaciers are our most visible evidence of global warming. They have integrated their climate variables in the Earth system. Their loss is readily apparent, and they have no political agenda. No, but the leftists who support global warming, the environmentalists that do support this, do. And my question is, who in the world is doing the peer review of this kind of stuff? They didn't even catch the winter-summer mistake. I mean, who's doing this peer review for you guys? Sierra Club? Greenpeace? I mean, you're telling me people who argue for the sun can't get reviewed? And yet someone who mixes up that the fact that we're closest to the summer and wintertime does get peer reviewed? Give me a break. Okay, and then every time you go see these global warming people, they always get in this political stuff at the end. I have seen many of these people. I saw one guy at Ohio State, some guy from University of Oklahoma. His name slips my name, but when I tried to get his presentation, he of course sent back, well, I don't want to release it because of some hee-haw. But he did send me some references of his research and what he thought were good arguments, and he sourced, guess what? Mother Jones magazine. That's no joke. Okay? But he, of course, went in this triad about against Fox News and President Bush. You know, and here, you know, all these environments, they're always saying we got to stamp out, you know, we got to increase regulations, we got to increase government funding. No kidding, Lonnie wants to increase government funding. You should see this video, when you see his presentation, the guy's flying all around the world on the taxpayers' dime. He gets all these I mean, he's treated like a celebrity. Okay, you better believe he wants greater funding, R&D. Okay? And he says, you know, in addition, the importance of consumer pressure should not be underestimated. You know, he makes all these economic arguments that I think would fall apart if you really looked at them. Restore the world leadership to our dying automobile industry. Believe me, you start regulating carbon, taxing carbon, you'll kill the auto industry. Save industry and consumers billions of dollars by becoming more efficient. You're telling me that by spending more money for my hybrid car, you're going to save me money? Think about it. Okay, reduce levels of smog and other air pollutants that result from burning fossil fuels and impair their health. Okay, once again, that pollution is feeding people. Okay, addressing the cause of global warming will make us richer, healthy, and more peaceful. What a deal. You're going to regulate our way to prosperity? You're going to tax our way to prosperity? Give me a break. If any of this stuff was true, the free market would have already developed it. Believe me, if the free market's not buying into it already, it's because it's not going to make products cheaper, it's going to make them more expensive. And the technology's out there. Prevailing myths: prehistoric climate change far exceeds the anticipated change in the next 100 years, so no need to worry. Variations in sunlight probably explains the recent warming trend. I think we've shown that. Satellite data contradicts the evidence of global warming trend. I think we showed that. Cooling trend during the 1940s-70 contradicts the global warming concept. Unless CO2 disappeared during that time period, I don't see a problem with that. The world should become global warming. The world should welcome global warming because it will help moderate the impacts of the impending ice age. I'd rather live in a warming trend than an ice age. People die during the ice age. Go back and study the history of the little ice age. That's where you got social revolutions. That's where our revolution came from. That's where Marie Antoinette lost her head. Okay, the French Revolution came out of the starving people during the Little Ice Age. History Channel has a great presentation on the Little Ice Age. Shows you the social turmoil that occurs when the Earth cools. Global warming will be good for agricultural CO2 enrichment. That's an accurate statement. Global warming theory has never been proven. I think we just proved in this presentation it's far from being proven. In fact, if anything, they've proven that CO2 doesn't cause it. They've proven that water vapor does, and they've proven that changes in the sun does. But water vapor has nothing, if anything, to do with it. Reduced emissions will severely damage our economy. You better believe it will, unless you figure out an alternative to petroleum. And I don't think Sierra Club or Al Gore is coming up with any alternatives to petroleum yet. Okay, this is what I always find confusing. In Al Gore's movie, he shows out of 928 peer-reviewed journals, 0 argued against global warming. That's what he says in his movie, right? But then the press goes out there, and out of 636 journals reports, they find 53% of the scientists. So why can the press find people that are skeptical, but the peer-reviewed people can't? Well, clearly, if you can get peer-reviewed and you don't even know that the sun is closest, or the Earth is close to the sun during wintertime, okay, these other people that are arguing for the sun, arguing for water vapor can't get published, give me a break. I mean, that's like, I mean, these peer-reviewed people must be like Sierra Club or Greenpeace. I mean, this is like 100 out of 100 petroleum scientists agree there is no man-made global warming. Biased populations give you biased results. Okay? Join the global warming consensus or the dog will die. This is nothing more than peer pressure. You don't get this kind of stuff, especially in a soft science like global warming, in any kind of a field. Even in economics, you can find economists that argue that a higher minimum wage will help unemployment. You know, you've always got these people that are going to disagree. You don't even have in physics. I bet there are people that disagree with E equals MC squared. Okay, this is you just don't see this in normal science, especially the soft sciences where there's so much variability. And when you have the sun and water vapor that they totally ignore, and yet they're not peer reviewing them. This isn't peer review. This is censorship. Okay? And lo and behold, go to the National Registry of Environmental Professionals, Global Climate Change Survey. This is the best one I found to try to get to this consensus argument. Okay? Right down here, 59% respond that current climatic activity exceeds normal calibrated by, over the last 100 years of weather data collected by, in large part, attributed to human activity. So yes, 59% do. 41% don't. That's almost, I mean, that's nowhere near a consensus. That's barely a majority. Okay? 82% of environmental and professionals think global warming is real. So right there, you've got 18% who don't even believe it's warming. And from their own temperature charts, you show that we're not warming. It is real, measurable, climatic trends currently in effect. 66% consider the rate at which global warming may occur to be serious. So only 66% even consider it serious. So bottom line is, if you find the most credible survey I found, and that's the National Registry of Environmental Professionals, only 59% really buy it. Okay? More importantly, what happens if you don't buy it? Well, you got it. Big Brother's watching. TV weathermen, agree with global warming or else. The Weather Channel was actually arguing that you yank credentials from people who disagree with you. What kind of a science does that? Science is supposed to embrace skeptics. That's how you are a progressive scientist, is skeptical. Otherwise, it's the status quo always. The only way you make anything advance, only way you have progress, is if you take what is commonly accepted and you shake it up. Back in 1492, if no one challenged the fact that we were flat, we'd still all believe we're flat. We'd still believe the Earth is, or the moon is made out of Swiss cheese, for God's sake. What's going on in this field, and this is what makes me so passionate about this issue, is what I see these global warming people do is they're discrediting science as a whole. Okay? They're using these Marxist tactics of silence the enemy, don't let anyone question it, join the herd or else. That's the tactics of a leftist politician, not science. And that's why I'm so passionate about this. Global warming gag order. Senators tell Exxon to shut up and pay up. Okay? You don't want the government getting in and dictating science. When's the last time we saw that? You got it, eugenics. What did eugenics lead to? You got it, good old Adolf Hitler. Okay? You don't want the government dictating the conclusion of scientists. And that's what you've got with global warming. Once again, Exxon cuts ties to global warming skeptics. Why shouldn't we be funding skeptics? As a matter of fact, I hope you want to fund skeptics because I can use the cash. I'm doing this on a shoestring. I hope everyone goes to internetskeptic.com, clicks on donate, and helps me make more of these videos because we got a lot more to go, but I need some help. If you are part of the, if you are a petroleum, someone who works for the petroleum industry or one of these think tanks like Competitive Enterprise Institute, donate me some money and help me out here. I'm fighting your battle for you. Okay? We got the Union of Concerned Scientists responding to global warming skeptics. They have like a blacklist here. If you go to the Union of Concerned Scientists, you know Hollywood was so upset about the communist blacklisting. Go look what they do. They blacklist skeptics. Okay? The Oregon Institute, there's another study out there called the Oregon Petition. It's debatable. However, there's what, 17,000 people signed that this was a bunch of garbage. Okay, global warming, skeptics under fire. Science is supposed to embrace the skeptics. You don't ostracize them, demonize them, cut their funding, and threaten them with prosecution, for God's sake. These guys are trying to get to the truth. And from the review of all this science, you can see there's a lot of truth to get to. Okay? Here's just basically the carbon cycle in general, to just put all this in perspective. The oceans, believe it or not, are where most CO2 comes from. The oceans are the hemoglobin of the world. Okay? The oceans, when CO2 gets too high, they absorb CO2. When it gets too low, they release it. It's called Henry's Law. Okay? It has nothing to do with global warming. It's a physical principle called Henry's Law. It's the diffusion of a gas in a liquid. You warm up the oceans, it releases CO2, you cool it down and it absorbs it. Go take a pop bottle, put it on a burner, and watch what happens. CO2 flies out of it. Okay, but they produce the vast majority of, they're basically the hemoglobin. Okay, they regulate CO2 in the atmosphere. Trees breathing, by the way, produce 50 to 60 billion tons. Okay, to put things in perspective, trees breathing alone produce 10 times as much CO2 as man does. Man produces 5.3. That's a drop in the bucket. Remember, man produces 5% of 5%. Okay, you can multiply that out and see that that's insignificant. So man's contribution is so doggone small, how could it ever lead to such catastrophic effects? Okay? The plants and everything else produces most atmospheric CO2. Here's an example of what happens when a volcano goes up. Okay? When Mount St. Helens went off, it released the energy of an atomic bomb every second for 9 hours. Enough rock and crud to fill a football field 600 miles high, as the mountaintop lost 1,300 feet of height. 3 billion cubic yards of rock, ash, snow, and ice were thrown. Okay? 260 square miles were severely damaged. That's one volcano by Mother Nature. One volcano produces more CO2 and pollution than man does in the entire industrial age. More importantly, you could take every power plant, utility, SUV, Hummer ever built, and you could put it into the crater of 230 miles. That's the scope. Man's producing like a little blob here. This is Mother Nature. Okay? Once again, CO2 down here. You could put every power plant you ever built into the crater of this Mount St. Helens. That's the scale. Okay? More importantly, a real scientist would say, hey, wait a minute. Let's look at the real science. The internet skeptic's telling me the sun is warming it. Well, there's other ways to prove that. If the sun is warming the Earth, think about it. We're part of a solar system. Wouldn't it be logical then to say, okay, if we're warming, what about the other planets? Well, lo and behold, Pluto's warming, as is Mars. And yet, Lonnie Thompson will tell you the sun's not responsible. I don't think you see many Martians up there driving SUVs. Okay? The facts are, the common denominator between Mars, Pluto, and Earth is the sun and is the solar system. Recently, this is National Geographic. Finally, these people, by the way, must not get peer-reviewed because you can't find anything about the sun. Mars melts, hints of solar, not human cause of warming, scientists say. Hints? For God's sake? Okay, help me understand this. Hints? I mean, this is what's so absurd about the science. Okay, that causes it. Okay, that should be a highly significant variable. We got to start looking at that because I can't explain CO2 causing that. And if both of them are melting, what's causing it? There's one common denominator between us and Mars, and that's the sun. I mean, hints, give me a break. The bottom line, they're just saying hints means they haven't even looked into it yet. That's even more disturbing. Okay? Well, lo and behold, as you know, if there's some evidence out there, you got Lonnie Thompson at this glacier. Well, next thing you're going to do is you can see good old Lonnie up on Mars with I want to see him plan his trip up there. Here's Lonnie over here with the Martians. He's doing the research now, I'm sure, and he'll have something out about, what's going on up on Mars sometime soon. He'll be paying for that trip to Mars with the taxpayer dollar also. Here's the Kyoto Treaty. Even if we abided by the Kyoto Treaty, what would it affect? It only avert 0.06 degrees Celsius to global warming. Now you're telling me we're going to spend 3 to 5% of our annual GDP for 0.06 degrees Celsius of a speculation? And by the way, how do we know if this even works? We would never even be able to measure whether or not we actually decrease CO2. There's no control. I mean, you can only guess at whether or not, especially with their models, for God's sake. But that's all you do. 3 to 5% GDP we're going to use to possibly prevent 0.06 degrees temperature? Give me a break. We have better things. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, did the scientists even know that CO2 lags behind temperatures? What does the lag of CO2 behind temperature in the ice core tell us about global warming? Go to Real Climate. They can explain it away from it, but the bottom line, what's the most likely cause? I mean, there may be some bizarro, improbable reason, but the most recent likely cause is the same reason why you have an annual cycle also. Temperature causes CO2 to increase. That's the most likely. In the healthcare profession, we used to say common illnesses occur commonly. You look for the most obvious cause. These guys will get this kind of data and explain it away. Sorry, pals. The laws of science apply to global warming like it does everybody else. The IPCC report coming out supposedly does not have the hockey stick chart in it. This comes from the Wall Street Journal. We're told that the upcoming report is also missing any reference to the infamous hockey stick. They're going to throw out the most important variable of their model, their dependent variable? Give me a break. A study by Michael Mann that purported to show 900 years of minor fluctuation meaning there was no little ice age or middle of warming period, followed by a dramatic spike over the past century. The IPCC report featured the graph in 2001, but has since been widely rebutted. Once again, if they're going to yank that chart, how in the world can you have zero peer-reviewed people being critical of it? Are they going to yank this chart because of no peer-reviewed data? That nobody disagreed with it? They're just going to kind of like remove it and remain silent? The facts are someone must have had a valid criticism about it, and if they did have a valid criticism, they should have been peer-reviewed. But once again, they're not being peer-reviewed because this is censorship. This isn't real science. This isn't real. They must have Sierra Club doing their peer review for them. Okay? Let's take a look. Just take a little closer look at this CO2 chart. We got, once again, as I pointed out, CO2 Mauna Loa. We know the problem with that. Once again, the cyclical pattern, once again, shows that temperature drives CO2, not the other way around, based upon the annual cycles. Key point here is this is the hockey stick chart. Notice here that the hockey stick chart, for one, only covers the northern hemisphere. Two, the data is from tree rings, coral, ice cores, and historical records. Okay, historically, this goes back from 1000 to 1980. Okay, you have temperature data from 1902 to 1998. So the only time period that they even have temperature is from 1992 to 1998. Just to give you a hint, the thermometer was invented back in 1714. Why in the world they don't have temperature data going back at least as far as the New Albany weather station, I have no idea. But they chose only to use temperature during this period right here. Lo and behold, they stopped using the temperature data, okay, in 1980, they stopped using the proxies. So temperature data is the only measurement from 1980 to 1998. Okay? So this part here is a direct measurement. So what you do is you have a bunch of proxies, and then suddenly you remove the proxies, and suddenly the chart starts changing behavior. Once again, that should raise a red flag. Your proxies aren't behaving like the direct measurements. You're probably having a measurement problem, not a theory problem. Okay? If this would have just been direct measurements going back, you'd probably have much more cyclical things. But once again, they don't use direct measurements when it was available. And two, when they do have it, they overlap the proxies with the direct measurement, weighing it down. And only once when you remove the proxies does temperature take off like a rocket. It's more of a construction of the chart problem than a realistic history of the chart. The other problem is, where is the empirical evidence? Okay? This is the simplest theory in the world to test, and yet nobody seems to have published empirical evidence proving it. Right? The whole key is that changes in CO2 from 280 to 380 can cause catastrophic temperature change. But hasn't anyone ever thought about taking a flask with atmospheric temperature and a sample of the atmosphere and altering the CO2 from 280 to 380, shining an infrared light on it, or a proxy for the sun on it, and measure the temperature change? Well, you can't find any peer-reviewed research out there showing that. There is no empirical evidence for it. However, I did find this, the greenhouse gas lab experiment. And you want to know what they do here? They use Alka-Seltzer to trap the CO2 so you get a flask of pure 100% CO2. Now, I'm not sure what the result here is. This may be due to the increased temperature due to being an exothermic reaction of the dissolving of the Alka-Seltzer. But the point is, when they demonstrate it, they don't demonstrate a fractional change in CO2. they show you that pure CO2 will absorb air temperature. So when you have oxygen or air compared against pure CO2, sure enough, the temperature does increase. But once again, that's a misleading experiment. We're not talking about 100% CO2. No one will argue that that doesn't trap some heat. We got an infrared spectrum scope that shows that. The point is, does a change from 280 to 380 cause catastrophic effects? That can be easily done. Any kid watching this that wants to win a science fair project can do it to disprove global warming, and go ahead and do it. Okay, you can be a science fair project winner. Okay, key is use that infrared lamp to measure. Okay, this comes from the IPCC, and this is what really gets me, when I say I think it's junk science, this is where it really becomes obvious. Okay? Now remember, water vapor is the most significant greenhouse gas. We've shown that. Okay? They never mention it, but they don't show it. The other thing is the sun probably has the most likelihood of being the other culprit also. So you got the sun and water vapor can probably explain, I would imagine, 99% of all global warming. The problem is, if you look at this chart, this comes from the IPCC report, and I encourage you to go get it. The first thing you will notice when you look at this chart is, guess what? There is no water vapor mentioned. Okay? And I'm looking at it again to make sure that that is accurate. There is no water vapor measurement. Now what this is the level of understanding. This is low understanding. This is high understanding. Okay? And this is warming and this is cooling. What do they understand a great deal about? You got it. CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, and the halocarbons. Okay, the greenhouse gases. They understand a great deal about that. Okay? What do you think this dead last one is? Take a wild guess. What do you think the dead last factor of global warming is? You got it. Probably the most likely one, the sun. How can you be studying CO2 versus the sun? I mean, if you walked outside and said, you know what, things are warming, I'm going to create a model of what's causing global warming. Would you think immediately, oh, CO2 causes it? No, I'd be sitting there on my porch, all of a sudden the sun comes up, I start getting warm, you say, you know what, I bet the sun's causing global warming. That's the other thing that's bizarre about the science. They didn't look at the most obvious causes. You know, once again, common illnesses occur commonly. The sun's most likely to cause, and yet, according to their own chart, it's one of the least understood variables. Once again, how can you have a consensus if you don't include water vapor and you don't understand the sun? That's like saying you've done a study on weight loss, but you don't know the impact of caloric intake and exercise. You might know a little bit about the shoes they're wearing, but you don't know how much exercise and food they're eating. It's absurd to sit there and say you can have a consensus under that. Okay? Once again, you got to get back to CO2. Now, once again, here's the CO2. Now, if you look, this is a CO2 absorption spectrum. CO2 has very small bands of absorption. So what we're talking about, this whole thing is about those two bands of absorption of infrared and the troposphere. Okay? First thing you should notice is this one band at 2.7 is irrelevant because it's overwhelmed by water vapor. Okay? So even though you absorb it here, water vapor dominates that. The other thing is look at all the absorption spectrum of water vapor. It's huge. Here's total absorption, and you can see those two are almost identical. There's very little difference between the water vapor IR spectrum absorption and the overall. Water vapor just simply dominates according to their own records. Now here's CO2. The only one that has any significance is this one right here at about 4.3 because it doesn't overlap with anybody else except a little bit with the nitrous oxide. It's all by itself. So all of global warming has to do with the IR radiation in that range. The problem is there's not that much IR radiation in that range. Okay, think about this as being going to a ball game and there's a home run hitter. They argue that the more CO2, the increase in temperature, meaning it can trap more heat. That's not true because there's a finite amount of heat. All the radiation, all the infrared radiation at that level is absorbed by 10 meters up in the atmosphere. That's it. 10 meters up, it's all absorbed, it's all done. It's like saying going to a ballpark. If you have one person out there with a glove and someone hits a home run, they can go get it. If I have 100 people out there ready to catch the ball, still there's only one person that can catch it. That's the same thing with here. There's only X number of light waves that are going to be released. So it doesn't matter how many CO2 molecules you've got out there. There's enough of them to absorb it by the time it even gets to 10 meters. Okay, so then you can increase CO2 all you want, but because you're already saturated, it doesn't do anything. At best, it lowers the level at which 100% of the infrared is absorbed. Okay? I read a study where if you doubled CO2 concentration, 100% of the absorption goes from 10 meters to 9.7 meters. So what? Convection would mix that up. So once again, this idea that increasing CO2 would lead to an increase in absorption, it doesn't. You're already absorbing 100% by the time it gets to 10 feet. Increasing the number of people to catch the home runs isn't the important factor. It's the number of home runs being hit, okay, that matters. And the number of home runs, think of it as the light energy. You're already catching 100% of it. Adding more of it, you can't catch more than 100% of the light. This is basically just a slide that explains all that. And once again, it simply points out that, by increasing CO2, you don't increase temperature, you just simply decrease the level at which 100% of the radiation is captured. You don't create energy this way. All you're doing is trapping it at a sooner level. That's it. So the whole theory behind CO2 causing it doesn't make any sense. Here is the chart showing water vapor. Water vapor, according to this study, is responsible for 95% of the Earth's greenhouse effect. Water vapor, here's CO2. You don't even hear about it. I mean, on these charts were done by real scientists, they don't even think about this. Water vapor is by far the dominant CO2. The way that CO2 becomes significant is when you yank water vapor, which is what the IPC does. Suddenly, when you yank water vapor, carbon dioxide becomes the most significant of the insignificant greenhouse gases. Okay? That's like saying if you're a drug company and you're doing a study on a cancer drug and some of your patients die, that's like them just saying, okay, well, let's just remove those patients that died from the study and we'll report on the ones that make our case. A drug company did this kind of stuff, they'd be shut down. Imagine if an oil company did this kind of research, where they simply ignore the things that work against them. Okay? The environmentalists would be going ape, you know what. So when you put all this together, what is the contribution of man? Well, remember, man produces 5% of 5%. CO2 is about 5%. When you put all this together, man's contribution to greenhouse gases is a minuscule 0.28%. Okay, we're causing global warming because we produce 0.28%. The natural variation is probably 100 times that, for God's sake, in a day. Okay, man doesn't produce greenhouse gases to any scale. We don't even produce that much CO2 out of the scale, 5%. Here's what else is interesting. You would think that the IPCC, if they're going to have a report that shows that they're understanding that they'd try to either include water vapor everywhere or nowhere. Well, sure enough, this comes from the IPCC, and what do they report? You got it, water vapor. Okay? So they do know water vapor's out there, and it is influences. Down here, it points out that nitrogen makes up 78% of the atmosphere. Oxygen makes up 20.9%. Okay? And so when you add those two up, you see there's very little left. There's what are called trace gases. However, there are a number of trace gases, such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone, which do absorb and emit infrared. Did you notice what I just read there? Okay. However, there are a number of trace gases, such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone, which do absorb the infrared radiation. Did I forget something, or did the IPC? They say water vapor here, then down here they ignore it. Okay? Then, however, down here they do mention it. They say, moreover, the atmosphere contains water vapor, which is also a natural greenhouse gas. Its volume mixing ratio is highly variable, but it is typically in the order of 1%. Because the greenhouse gases absorb the infrared radiation emitted by the Earth and emit infrared radiation up and down, they tend to raise temperatures near the surface. Water vapor, CO2, and O3 absorb solar shortwave radiation. So down here they do say water vapor is a greenhouse gas. Okay? So they're mentioning it, they claim it, so let's say what do they do with it? Well, lo and behold, if you're going to create a model, you're going to have to understand the potency, the greenhouse gas potency of these greenhouse gases. Well, they come up with what's called a global warming potential. And once again, here is their report. These are the global warming, this is the potential, or the efficacy, or the power, the global warming power of a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide is 1. Methane is 21. Nitrous oxide is 310. Meaning nitrous oxide has 310 times the global warming potential of carbon. Meaning that one molecule can contribute 310 times more to global warming than carbon dioxide. So as you can see, carbon dioxide is a relatively weak greenhouse gas. Some of them go all the way up to SF, that's something, what is that, sodium fluoride, is 23,900 times more potential than carbon dioxide. Okay? So, there you have it. What do you notice that's missing? The global warming potential of water vapor and nitrogen. Nitrogen also absorbs, because you got all this nitrogen and oxygen. Nitrogen also absorbs some infrared radiation. However, they don't mention water vapor, nor do they mention nitrogen. Okay? And in this case, they don't mention ozone either. Okay, well, someone got confused about it. Someone was a little frustrated about it. So what they did was they were frustrated, and you'll see this all over the place. Weighted estimates for water vapor are not presented because the International Panel on Climate Change has not established a definitive global warming potential factor for water vapor. Now, if you know anything about these models, that is absolutely absurd. That's like having a model on weight loss and not understanding the contribution of exercise and caloric intake. Okay, that's like saying, well, you can go exercising and it might help lose weight. This is the most significant variable they've got, and they don't define it. That's absolutely absurd. I mean, how can you run a model? How can you have a consensus if you don't even understand the most significant variable? Okay? This person did a, because you can say that, okay, if global warming is 95% attributed to water vapor, he was able to walk backwards to figure out what the global warming potential of water must be, and he found out that it's 270. Okay? So the global warming of water, according to this study, is 270. 270 times that of carbon dioxide. And remember, this is so much more prevalent than carbon dioxide. Okay? So as you can see, it's it's absurd to sit there and say you can have a scientific consensus with this many questions unanswered. Okay? Here's a report from the, I believe it was from the EPA, and when they have down here the weighted contributions of greenhouse gases, you have to have the global warming potential to calculate all this out. What do they do for water vapor? Not available. Okay? So how can you, you don't know what, and then they have a total down here. How can you have a total when you have an NA? That makes no sense at all. This could be 1 billion up here, so all these other ones are insignificant, but they still have a total. That's another way to lie with statistics. Global warming potential value for water vapor has not been determined by the IPCC. Okay? They haven't even determined the most significant variable. I mean, that's absolutely bizarre. That's the type of stuff Richard Nixon would do. Okay, in a nutshell, let's wrap this thing up. Okay? You can't have a global warming model because you don't have consensus on the data. You have to garbage in, garbage out. If you don't know what data you're going to put in, it doesn't matter if you have the most significant, most powerful computer in the world. It can only crunch the numbers that you give it. You give it garbage numbers, you get garbage out. You can find more temperature charts for temperature going back than you can shake a stick at. What do? Average all these charts? It makes absolutely no sense. This also is their dependent variable. This is the y of y equals mx plus b, the most significant variable, because this is what they're regressing their entire model on. Okay? Doesn't make any sense. Lonnie Thompson's and Al Gore's own chart shows you that CO2 temperature doesn't follow CO2. CO2 is at record highs, yet temperature is actually falling from the most recent peak. Here you can see temperature leads CO2. Their model is backwards. They have what's called a misspecified model. In reality, they're saying y equals mx plus b. Y is temperature, and x is CO2. In reality, CO2 is the y, and temperature is the x. So once again, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Thank you very much. Once again, I do hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you show this in your science class because it's a great review on critical analysis of scientific research. And most importantly, I do hope you visit the www.theinternetskeptic.com, hit on that donate button, or go buy a book from the bookstore and help out the cause. We need more people out there getting the message out, because if the leftists win, if they get away with this global warming theory, we're going to get Al Gore in office, we're going to get a lot more regulations, and I don't know of any society that has ever regulated its way to prosperity. Okay, more importantly, we have more important things facing this nation. We can be using that 3 to 4, 5% of GDP that they're going to use to fight global warming. We can use that to solve Social Security, improve education. There's a whole bunch of other socially beneficial things we can do with that money. And more importantly, we need to stay focused on the war on terror. Okay, we cannot allow global warming to replace the war on terror is the biggest threat to America. Al Gore's already out there trying to spin it that way. We need to start realizing the terrorists are coming to kill us. We need to stay focused. We can't be distracted by this global warming stuff. Okay? I can guarantee you terrorists will kill us. Global warming will feed us. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the video. How will they trend together? They don't do that, and it's kind of uncharacteristic for most of science, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but I want you to remember how they present this chart. Here it is again, one above, not overlapping, one above. Okay? Here are the peaks of temperature. There were no SUVs back then. There's no SUVs back then. Here is the CO2, record high, 370. They show it in dramatic fashion by having to put it off the chart. But the key is, temperatures are all higher than today. Okay? CO2 is off the record, off the charts. These peaks occurred when we didn't have SUVs or global warming or the industrial age. So what was causing the CO2 and temperature spikes back then that's not causing it today? And once again, this temperature level is below the previous peaks. So how can you have record level CO2s and not have a record peak in temperature?